What happens when the most powerful man in the world loses his mind? When the line between God and mortal, pleasure and pain, sanity and abyss simply dissolves? This isn't just a story of corruption. It is a tale of how one man's shattered psyche nearly shattered the known world, turning the heart of civilization into a theater of nightmares. His reign was not written in stone or law, but in blood, fear, and the chilling echoes of laughter in halls of unimaginable sin. In the long and often brutal history of the Roman Empire, few names are whispered with such a mixture of fascination and horror as Gaius Caesar Germanicus. To his soldiers, in his youth, he was Caligula, the little boot, a beloved mascot and son of the heroic general Germanicus. To the people of Rome, weary from the paranoid and gloomy rule of Emperor Tiberius, he was a ray of hope, a golden youth destined to restore glory to the empire. When he ascended to the throne, the city erupted in celebration. They saw in him not a future tyrant, but a savior. And for a time, he played the part perfectly. The first months of his rule were a dream. He freed citizens unjustly imprisoned, abolished unfair taxes, and hosted the most spectacular games the Colosseum had ever seen. The people adored him. The Senate praised him. It seemed as if a new golden age was dawning. But beneath the surface, a sickness was taking root, a fever that would not only ravage his body, but utterly consume his soul. The turning point came with a severe illness that left him bedridden for weeks. The empire held its breath, praying for the recovery of their beloved leader. And he did recover. But the man who rose from that sickbed was not the same man who had fallen ill. Something inside him had fractured, cracked open to reveal a darkness that no one could have predicted. The charming, benevolent ruler was gone, replaced by a monster wearing his face. The Golden Age was over. The reign of madness was about to begin. His first act as a changed man was to squander the vast fortune left to him by Tiberius. Rome's treasury, one of the largest in history, was bled dry in less than a year. He commissioned projects of pure insanity. He built a 2-mile-long floating bridge of boats across the Bay of Naples, just so he could ride his horse back and forth across it for 2 days, clad in the armor of Alexander the Great. He ordered the construction of 2 colossal pleasure barges on Lake Nemi, complete with marble floors, heating systems, and jewel-encrusted sails, floating palaces dedicated to his own hedonism, while whispers of grain shortages began to trouble the city. When the money ran out, his cruelty found a new, terrifying purpose. He resurrected the treason trials he had once banned, but this time the charge was a death sentence for anyone with wealth. Rich senators were accused of phantom crimes, their estates confiscated to fund the emperor's whims. He imposed bizarre taxes on everything from lawsuits to food, strangling the commerce of his own empire. But this was more than just greed. It was a game. He reveled in the power to create and destroy fortunes with a single word. He once complained during a game that the public was not showing enough enthusiasm, so he randomly ordered a section of the crowd to be seized and thrown into the arena with the wild beasts, simply to liven things up. He watched, smiling, as his own citizens were torn apart. The imperial palace, once the center of Roman governance, was transformed into the epicenter of his depravity. The great halls became a stage for endless orgies, where the lines between noble and slave, man and woman, blurred into a grotesque spectacle of lust. He took a perverse pleasure in humiliating the Roman elite. Senators and their wives were not invited to these parties, they were commanded to attend. He would personally inspect the wives of high-ranking officials, discussing their physical attributes as if they were livestock, before taking them to his private chambers. He would then return to the banquet and critique their performance in bed to their husbands, all while the men were forced to smile and nod, terrified that a single frown could mean their execution. His own sisters were not spared his predatory nature. He engaged in incestuous relationships with all three of them, but he was particularly obsessed with his favorite, Drusilla. He treated her not as a sibling, but as a wife, flaunting their profane union in public. When she died suddenly from a fever, his grief was as monstrous as his love. He declared a period of public mourning so absolute that laughing, bathing, or even dining with one's family was punishable by death. He then had her deified, proclaiming her a goddess and forcing the Senate to worship her as such. Her death seemed to be the final snap, the event that severed his last frayed tether to reality. It was then that Caligula decided he, too, was no longer a man. He was a living god. He began appearing in public dressed as Hercules, Venus, or Apollo. He ordered the heads of famous statues of gods throughout the empire to be removed and replaced with replicas of his own. He built a bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill directly to the Temple of Jupiter, so he could consult with his fellow god whenever he pleased. He would stand in the temple, demanding that the people worship him, and would often engage in long, one-sided conversations with the statue of Jupiter itself, sometimes arguing with it, sometimes shouting at it as an equal. His ultimate act of blasphemy was his plan to erect a colossal golden statue of himself in the Holy of Holies at the Temple in Jerusalem. This was an act so sacrilegious, it threatened to ignite a massive rebellion across the entire eastern half of the empire. Only the careful diplomacy of his advisors and the eventual death of the emperor himself prevented a holy war of catastrophic proportions. Paranoia became the air he breathed. He trusted no one. His childhood friends, the advisors who had served him faithfully, the very guards who protected him, all were seen as potential assassins. Executions became a daily routine. He invented a new form of torture, ordering that victims be killed with many small deliberate cuts so that they could feel themselves dying. He took a sadistic glee in forcing fathers to watch the execution of their own sons, often inviting them to dinner just hours later, where he would joke and feast while the grieving father had to pretend to be enjoying himself. To show any sign of sadness was to sign your own death warrant. His contempt for the traditions and institutions of Rome knew no bounds. The Senate, once the proud governing body of a republic, was his favorite chew toy. He would make them run for miles in their togas alongside his chariot. He would grant them an audience only to dismiss them with a wave of his hand. And in the most famous and bizarre display of his madness, he turned to his beloved horse, Incitatus. The horse lived a life of luxury beyond the dreams of most humans. It had a stable made of marble, a manger of ivory, and was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. It was adorned with a collar of precious jewels and purple blankets, the color of royalty. But this was not enough. To show his ultimate contempt for the Roman aristocracy, Caligula announced his intention to make Incitatus a consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic. Whether he was serious or not is debated, but the message was clear. His horse was more worthy of power and respect than the entire Senate of Rome. The empire was groaning under the weight of his insanity. Famine stalked the provinces while the emperor designed new pleasure palaces. The military, once the backbone of Roman power, grew restless and resentful. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, lived in a state of constant simmering fear. They were his tools, but they knew they were also disposable. Every day, they watched his paranoia grow, his actions become more erratic, and they knew it was only a matter of time before he turned on them completely. For the powerful men of Rome, the equation became brutally simple. It was his life or theirs. The conspiracy was not born of patriotism, but of pure survival. The leader was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard. Chaerea was a veteran soldier, a man of dignity, but Caligula had singled him out for constant mockery. The emperor would taunt him for his high-pitched voice, using crude and insulting passwords whenever Chaerea was on duty. This daily humiliation hardened Chaerea's resolve. He would not just kill a tyrant, he would reclaim his honor. The day of reckoning came during a series of games held for the deified Augustus. On the final day, Caligula was leaving the theater through a private corridor to address a group of young performers. It was the moment Chaerea and his fellow conspirators had been waiting for. As the emperor paused to speak with the youths, Chaerea approached him from behind and asked for the day's password. Caligula, with a sneer, gave him another lewd and insulting reply. It was the last thing he would ever say. Chaerea drew his sword and struck the first blow, a deep gash to the emperor's neck and shoulder. Caligula staggered, crying out in shock and pain, but he did not fall. Another conspirator, Cornelius Sabinus, stabbed him in the chest, and the emperor collapsed. The narrow corridor erupted into a frenzy of violence. The other guards, senators, and nobles who were part of the plot swarmed the fallen emperor, a whirlwind of blades driven by years of pent-up fear and hatred. They stabbed him again and again and again, 30 times in total. It was not just an assassination, it was an exorcism. But their bloody work was not finished. In their fury to extinguish his line, a group of soldiers stormed the palace and found Caligula's wife, Melonia Caesonia, weeping over her husband's body. They murdered her without hesitation. And then, in a final, horrifying act of brutality, they found their infant daughter, Julia Drusilla. They took the child by the ankles and swung her head against a stone wall, shattering her skull. The bloodline of Germanicus, once the hope of Rome, was extinguished in a final spasm of violence. The immediate aftermath was chaos. For a brief moment, it seemed the Republic might be restored. But in the end, it was the Praetorian Guard, the very men who had murdered one emperor, who created the next. The age of imperial madness was far from over. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, but it left a permanent scar on the Roman psyche. He was a man who inherited the world and chose to set it on fire simply to watch it burn. He was a living testament to the terrifying truth that absolute power does not just corrupt, it has the power to unmake a man entirely, leaving nothing behind but a legacy of darkness and a cautionary tale whispered for millennia. If you found this journey into the heart of madness compelling, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden History of Human Race for more tales from the shadows of history.